Hello and welcome back to Beyond the To-Do List, a podcast about productivity. I'm Eric Fisher, your host, as we discuss the true goal of productivity, living a more meaningful life. This week, I am joined by Jorge Arango, the host of the Informed Life podcast and also the author of Duly Noted, Extend Your Mind Through Connected Notes. And as an information architect, we are diving into his book to explore how our environment, the tools we use, and the interactions that we have play an important role in our thinking process when it comes to note-taking and what we do with those notes. We're going to talk about moving our thoughts out of our head and into the world so that we can do something with them, understanding different types of notes, and how knowing how different tools, digital versus analog, can make a difference as well and improve our capturing to revisit our insights, and forging new ones. That note-taking isn't just about taking down information. It's about having a dynamic process that involves linking notes together, revisiting notes, and creating long-term learning with the connection of all those ideas, ours and others that we've come across. I know that this is going to be helpful for you creatively, organizationally, and productively. So enjoy this conversation with Jorge Arango. Well, this week it is my privilege to welcome to the show Jorge Arango. Jorge, welcome to Beyond the To-Do List.
Thank you, Eric. It's a pleasure to be here.
I was excited when I heard about it's new in the sense that it's 2024. I mean, hey, it's a new 2024 book, right? So you've got a book out. It's called Duly Noted, Extend Your Mind Through Connected Notes. You also host a podcast, The Informed Life, which is great. Tell me a little bit more about the podcast first.
Funny enough, the podcast started as a way to do research for the book. I've been working as an information architect for a long time. And in the course of doing my work, I always took a lot of notes and had to be organized just to do my work. And I had this insight at some point that many of the techniques that I was bringing to client work in organizing large-scale information environments were things that I was also using to organize myself and to make it possible for me to do the work. So I thought, I would like to write a book about this. And one of the first things I thought was, well, it's not going to be very interesting if it's all about how I do it. I would love to hear how other people do it. So I started the podcast as an interview series to hear from other folks on how they were organizing information. Now, what happened is I recorded the first 5 or 6 episodes and realized that a lot of people are doing very similar things. It's like, this is not going to be a lot of fun if it's everyone's doing the same things, right? So it's kind of like ventured further afield from the initial purpose because of that. But yeah, the show explores how people organize information to get things done. So basically, kind of at the highest level, how are we managing the information in our lives? Whether we're doing so for ourselves or whether we are, like myself, people who design these things for other people to be able to use information.
And being an information architect, I've honestly never come across that title before in my life until you. And you've had 2 other books, Living in Information, which is responsible design for digital places, and Information Architecture for the Web and Beyond. So one of the titles of the book starts as Living in Information. I would almost say we're almost drowning in information these days. It's a bit hard to paddle through. So that's why we need an architect to design those digital spaces.
The person who is most responsible for popularizing the phrase information architect, Richard Saul Wurman, he wrote a book called Information Anxiety way back in the 1980s. And I think the image he used was of a tsunami of information. He said, people are drowning in this tsunami of information. And this was before the internet, right? And the phrase the information architect itself, it's funny now that I've written a book that is not aimed at people who practice information architecture or user experience design or any of these things, but has a broader audience. I've had at least one reviewer say, the author is a quote unquote information architect. I chuckled when I saw that because I thought the quotes mean that this person thinks I invented the title. But it's an actual thing. There are people whose job it is to structure information environments so that other people can find stuff and use it, right? So if you think about whenever you use an online store and you find a product, right? If you find it easily, that's because somebody has taken care to structure that environment so that things are findable and understandable. That's basically what we do. And as you might imagine, that has direct applicability to things like organizing notes.
So speaking of that, again, the book is called Duly Noted, Extend Your Mind Through Connected Notes. And there's a couple of different things to pick at there. Ideally, we start with, you say that notes are not just for remembering things. It goes beyond just remember the milk, remember to do this. It's more than just Post-its that are sticking there because, Post-its posted don't necessarily call attention to themselves unless they're super neon. But again, if you get enough of them, then it's a sea of information that means nothing and it calls nothing out. It calls your attention to all of it and none of it at the same time. Forest for the trees or Post-it for the Post-its. I don't know. There's probably a metaphor in there somewhere. But you say that it's not just about remembering things. It's about connecting them, that notes are for thinking. What do you mean by this?
Yeah. And I have to say, this is something that is relatively new to me. Most of my life, I think I thought of notes like I suspect a lot of people think of notes primarily as means for remembering, right? And you brought up what I think of as perhaps the prototypical example, the shopping list, right? Like the grocery list. And I've had it happen, as I'm sure many people listening in might have had it happen, that I'm standing in the middle of the grocery store in the aisles and going, oh my gosh, why am I here? Which is it's a particularly frustrating situation, right? So we write things down before we leave the house so that when we get there, we know that we have to buy tortillas and quinoa and coconut milk or whatever it is, right? That's a case in which we're using notes to augment our memory. It's kind of like a prosthetic memory of some sort. And I think that that's how a lot of us think about notes. What happened to me is that in the course of my work as an information architect, and through exposure to colleagues in the field, I became exposed to recent thinking in cognitive science around what is referred to in the field as the extended mind theory, which posits that thinking is not something that happens exclusively in the brain. I think that a lot of us, myself included, for a long time, I thought that thinking was something that I did in my brain, and then I wrote down whatever the results were of thinking, and that's what became the notes. But this line of research, this line of thinking in cognitive science around the extended mind, it posits that thinking is something that actually happens as a series of interactions between the brain, our nervous system, our bodies, and the environment, and things in the environment, right? I have a colleague, Carl Fast. He and another friend, Steven Anderson, co-wrote a book called Figure It Out, which is about this idea. And in that book, they bring up an example that I think you and a lot of folks listening in might be able to relate to. Imagine that you are looking at a pile of coins of different denominations, and you're asked to count how much money there is on the table. I think you'll find it a lot easier to do that if you can use your finger to move the coins and group them into piles based on denomination so that you have 5 quarters, 10 nickels, 6 pennies, or whatever it is. That's much easier to do than if you were to just look at them and try to count them in your head, right? Understanding that that is how thinking happens as a set of interactions between our bodies and our nervous system and things in the environment and the people in the environment, it changes how you think about things like notes. Because all of a sudden you realize that some of the things that you use notes for help you with other cognitive tasks. For example, you might have had the experience of sitting down to plan out a presentation. In school, teachers told us to write an outline if we were going to make an essay, right? When you do that, when you sit with a blank piece of paper to hash out a presentation, usually what you do is you start writing things down. And then when you see the words in the page, they spur other ideas. You may think, there's a topic that needs to bridge these two. And then you kind of write it in between. And in some ways, the piece of paper, it becomes kind of like a buffer, right? Like a part of your cognitive apparatus where you are doing a lot of the thinking. It's not something that is happening exclusively in the mind. It's something that's happening somewhere between your brain and the paper. And as you move your hand over the sheet of paper, thinking is happening. That's the best way that I can describe it. Obviously, we don't do this just with paper. We also do it with computers, but the idea is the same. These things are not serving as the output of a process that has happened in your brain. They're actually an important part of the process. And if you realize that, then you can start doing things like thinking about which means of note-taking are more apt for different cognitive tasks.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by the whole process of thinking outside yourself or thinking outside of your brain I was trying to think of the best way to put it, something to do with that part of the process of thinking has to do with external, tangible manipulation. Let's go with that. Because for me, and a lot of people would probably know this, I am an external verbal processor. So me being stuck in my head and or me typing or moving things around, that it doesn't do as much, but me walking and talking, or at least talking, it captures it. And we can get more into capturing things for sure, because that's part of this whole process. Sometimes you have to, in order to take those notes, in order to get those external, then you can do, it's very David Allen. Your mind is for having ideas, not for holding them. And that's what you're talking about here. The manipulation of it doesn't happen when it's in your head. It happens outside of yourself, and then you can process it by yourself or with others, as we'll get to later as well.
Yeah, Allen talks about, he uses this phrase, mind like water, right? Where he says, you have these things that if you don't capture them, they will kind of stay in perpetual repeat in your mind. I think he's circling around the same idea as this notion that if you leverage things in your environment, in his case, it's, he talks about lists, right? Like you make these different lists. The lists become a part of your thinking environment of sorts. And in getting it out of your head and onto one of these lists, now you have freed up your cognition to work on other things, knowing that the idea is held somewhere that you can circle back to. So it becomes a sort of holding place, again, some kind of buffer. It's an extension of your mind.
You mentioned different forms of note-taking for different needs. What are some of those different, we can say analog and digital and have that be two big categories, but there are a number. I mentioned Post-it notes. We've mentioned typing. We've mentioned recording and dictation. What are we missing here in that plethora of options?
Yeah, it's good that you bring up Post-it notes, because Post-it notes is something that a lot of folks are going to be familiar with. And let's compare them with what we were talking about earlier, the grocery list, right? You could write down a grocery list in a Post-it note, but I would argue that that might not be the best medium for that, especially if you have to buy a lot of stuff, right? Like most Post-it notes, I think that the typical size is something like 3 by 3 inches, which is not going to hold a lot. By the nature of the fact that they have sticky glue on one side, they're really meant to be written on one side of the note. They're not as nice to put in your pocket. They might get, lint and stuff on them because of the stickiness. So you might argue that something like a pocket notebook might be a better medium to hold the grocery list than a sticky note. Now, what is a sticky note good for? Sticky notes are really good for allowing you to put ideas into a physical space temporarily in a way that you can easily reaccumulate, right? So if you've ever had the experience of doing a brainstorming session with other folks in a room where you have a whiteboard and sticky notes, the practical use of sticky notes becomes apparent. You write down one idea per note, you put them up on the whiteboard, and you can do that without any order, right? Like you can just do a brain dump. It's like, okay, let's just brainstorm and try to come up with as many ideas as possible. And you write them down. And then you say, okay, now let's stop and see what groups might come out of that. So you do another exercise where you cluster them. Well, the fact that the notes have this kind of lightly tacky glue means that you can easily peel them from the whiteboard and move them to another place, right? So you can easily move them around and they can hold their position temporarily. That's a superpower that those things have. And if you understand that capability, you can start making this kind of internal taxonomy of saying, well, for grocery lists, I will use a pocket notebook. For brainstorming with a group of people, I will use a whiteboard and sticky notes. So those are different media, right? Another key distinction, and this is one that I write about in the book, and I must add, these ideas are not original to me. I'm just kind of relaying what I've learned as I do my work and as I've learned to do in my own note-taking practice. But the distinction between what you can think of as temporary or transient notes versus what you might call an evergreen note. What do we mean by that? So when you get home from the grocery store with your bags full of groceries, you no longer have much use for that list that you made, right? So you crumple it up and toss it in the bin. That's what I think of as a transient note. It's something that you use for a short period of time to, in this case, augment your memory. Although if you're like brainstorming, or outlining a presentation, you might also, when you're done making the deck, you might crumple the outline, right? So those are all kind of transient. You can compare and contrast that to the type of note that you take when you're, say, learning about a subject. Maybe you're reading a book and you're trying to learn about generative artificial intelligence, right? So you're learning about all these subjects and you're taking notes about them. Now, those might be ideas that you want to circle back to. In some cases, you might circle back to them years later, right? So those are what you might think of as evergreen notes. And as you might expect, there are some note-taking media that are more effective at capturing and allowing you to circle back to evergreen notes than media that are better tailored for something like a transient note. And knowing why you're taking notes helps you pick what medium to use.
Perfect. It's like knowing what tool is best for what job. And I think that's the thing is we don't often think about that in terms of we use whatever's at hand or we use whatever we're used to, not thinking that there are better note-taking tools for certain note-taking jobs.
That's right. And we use, if you think about it, we use this word note to mean a bunch of things that are really quite different, right? So sticky notes are a type of note. I'm writing notes right now of our conversation on a paper notebook, and we call these notes, even though they're quite different from the sticky notes. Annotations, the highlights and notes that you make when you're reading a book in Kindle, we call those notes, and those are very different, right? So it's worth acknowledging that this is one of those words that we have that is actually a little overloaded. And it behooves you, if you're going to be someone who does knowledge work for a living, or maybe is feeling a little overwhelmed with information like you were talking about earlier, right? Then one step that you can take is to start examining the means that you have to work with information. And that requires more precise language. So that's one of the things that I'm hoping that the book helps people with, is understanding that you might call it all notes, but they're not all the same. And it behooves you to know which is which and what they're for.
You also in the book talk about brevity and the role that it takes in note-taking, how making each note a single concept can help with retrieval and also connection to other notes. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah. Now that we've laid down some of the kind of basic ideas here, I can kind of let the cat out of the bag by saying that the book is primarily focused on evergreen note-taking. So this notion that you are writing things down because you're learning about them and want to circle back to them over time. And I say that because transient note-taking is perfectly valid and it's something that I do like everyone else, right? But this book is primarily focused on showing you how to build a system that will allow you to learn over time, have a knowledge repository that grows over time. And that requires particular types of tools. And I argue in the book that even though it is possible to do this with paper, and people have throughout the ages used paper to do this, computers open up many possibilities. Computers make it much easier to capture knowledge in this way, think about things in this way. Now we can get into what that means, but to your question specifically, I mention in the book what you can think of as 3 principles for what you can call connected note-taking, which is the kind of note-taking that you need to do if you're going to have this evergreen knowledge repository. And the 3 principles are the following. The first is what you've called out, which is you should aim to make short notes. And by that, I mean notes that are focused on a single idea. So the example we brought up earlier, like you're learning about generative AI, right? So you might determine that an important idea in that field is something called embeddings, right? So you might start a note just for the subject of embeddings. And at first, it might be that there isn't much there because you don't know much about it, right? But you know that there is an important concept called an embedding. And you focus that note on that. And you might have another note that is focused on language models. And that note will be just focused on that subject. So it's you're thinking about ideas getting their own notes. They're shorter than you would take if you were just writing things down linear. The second principle is that you should look to link your notes, right? So if you have been taking those kind of short notes that I'm talking about here, you're going to quickly find that the ideas in those notes relate to each other. So there's a relationship between a language model and embeddings. And in the course of writing about one, you may drop a link to the note that talks about the other, right? In much the same way that a Wikipedia page can point to another Wikipedia page.
That's actually a really great illustration because a lot of people have that in their head as to doing wiki dives where they start on one page, but they end up 7, 12, 20 pages deep on other things by clicking through those links. So it's a practical metaphor. It's a reality metaphor, I guess.
Well, and this is almost like, imagine if instead of navigating Wikipedia and getting lost in the links like that, you're instead writing something like a Wikipedia for yourself, right? That's what we're talking about here. Hopefully that makes clear why I think that computers are especially well suited to this, right? Because even though you can do this sort of thing with paper, and people have with things like index cards, following a reference from one index card to another index card, well, it's a mechanical activity that requires a lot of organization and a lot of space if you're going to do a lot of it, right? It's much easier to do it with computers. And I might add, part of the reason why this book exists now is that there are tools that have come out, I would say, in the last 4 to 5 years that bring these capabilities, many of which have been available, but in research and specialized environments for the last 3 to 4 decades, these new tools bring these capabilities to the mainstream. So if you think about tools like Notion or Obsidian or Rome Research, they really are tools that let you build something akin to a personal Wikipedia, where you do these short notes and link them very easily.
I will preface and say there are episodes in the works to talk specific deep dives on those types of tools, maybe even individually or collectively. I don't know yet, but it is in process.
Oh, fantastic. Well, I would encourage your listeners to be on the lookout for those conversations. I think that these tools really are a significant shift. They bring capabilities to our kind of cognitive tool set that were, again, possible but impractical before. And if you learn to use them, you are going to develop a kind of superpower. Okay, I'll just put it like that. But I promised 3 principles. Let me just mention the third one really quick because it really is important. The third principle is that you should look to nurture your notes. And what I mean by that is I think that a lot of us grew up taking notes in school. And I'll speak for myself. When I did that, I would listen to what the teacher was saying in class and I would write down, like lecture notes, right? And then I would study for the exam using those notes. And when the exam was over, I never turned to them again. Right? Like that was it. Like, probably toss them. I don't know what happened to those notebooks. They're long gone. And if you're going to be learning any kind of complex subject, first of all, the first few times that you deal with it, you're by definition not going to know a lot. So you're not going to be comprehensive about what you write down. You're going to be wanting to circle back to those things as your knowledge grows over time, right? And if you're working with paper, you're going to have to be super disciplined. You're going to have to be carefully index your things so that you can circle back to those ideas. But with digital systems of the sort that we're talking about here, you're literally one link away, right? It's fairly easy to come back to an idea and grow it over time. It's not going to happen on its own, though. So working with these systems, the idea is that you keep coming back to things as your knowledge accrues over time, and your knowledge will accrue as you circle back to it. So there's this virtuous cycle happening. The metaphor that I use in the book is that of a knowledge garden. The idea of thinking of the place where you do your thinking as a garden is not, again, it's not something that is original to this book. I've traced the notion of gardening as an information management practice at least as far back as the 1970s to Xerox PARC. but if you pardon the pun, it's a very fruitful metaphor because much like a garden, it's kind of an environment. It's kind of a place that you're developing where you're going to be doing work. It's not going to happen on its own. A garden requires pruning. It requires watering. It requires planting seeds. It has all of these tasks that you do, but a lot of people find pleasure in it. Gardens are a place of solace and a place of introspection and a place where you can work with your hands and do craft. And building a knowledge garden is kind of like that, but it's a place to develop the craft of thinking. And that requires that you think of working with ideas as something that requires nurturing. And as you learn more about a particular idea, you come back to it and you work on it. And over time, you end up with this collection of notes that embody a lot of thinking, but where a lot of thinking has happened. And I make that distinction because I think a lot of people kind of focus too much on the product. They think that they win if they have the most notes. It's like the notes in some way are kind of evidence of the work. The really valuable thing is the learning and the thinking that happens as you take the notes. It's not the notes per se.
It's not a competition. One, it's not about who has the most seeds, which is in this metaphor of a garden. I would say each note is a seed. It's also not about how many pieces of fruit are grown. It's about having the best fruit, the prize winning fruit. It's the best of the best, in other words. And I think in some of the ways, I mean, again, we have to tend our garden. We have to cultivate. We have to weed. But in the process of doing that, sometimes the seeds, getting to another part of the book where you talk about connecting your notes, the seeds cross-pollinate and one note and another note become a fruit that you never would have conceived of, but it happens.
Yeah, that's right. You want to set up conditions for these serendipitous collisions between ideas, right? Many insights come from your mind, sometimes subconsciously, putting together ideas that might not naturally go together, right? And you're like, oh, breakthrough, now I know what to do about this thing that I was stuck on. This actually brings us to a subject that I think is on a lot of folks' minds when they think about this stuff, which is the role of artificial intelligence in all this. One of the risks of working with technology is that you might confuse the means with the ends. We have amazing tools nowadays that can do things like find possible affinities between ideas. And if you do what I'm suggesting in this book, if you take notes that are focused on individual ideas and you have a large collection of said notes, then you can use things like language models to help you find possible connections, these collisions that we're talking about, right? Then that can be really helpful. It can help you think about things in different ways. But again, it's very important that you don't think of these tools as things that will think for you. The idea is that you develop better ways of thinking, not that you delegate your thinking completely. I've heard an analogy used with calculators, right? Calculators ease a lot of the work that we do when we're dealing with numbers, but you have to have knowledge of how to use a calculator. In some ways, it's not going to do the math for you. It's going to help you do it faster, right? And these tools, both AI powered tools and otherwise, are means to an end. The end is really about better thinking, and it's about growing as a person who can master their relationship with knowledge and information, and not somebody who becomes somehow dependent on tools. I just wanted to clarify that because it's something that I suspect is on a lot of people's minds.
Yeah, that's a great clarification. I'm glad you brought that up. I think a lot of people are thinking, okay, I get the garden and I want to create a garden. What are the steps? Well, like, how do we get started? What are the first few steps to get us started to create a garden?
I would say that the first thing is recognizing that you have both a need and maybe a propensity for this kind of thing, right? I wouldn't say that this is for everybody. I would say that the folks for whom this is best suited are people who have to deal with a lot of information in their work, right? So I've heard from a lot of researchers, for example, for whom this kind of thing is very useful. If you are somebody who is in academia somehow, maybe you're working on a graduate degree or a PhD or something like that, or maybe a teacher, right? People who are writing a book, people for whom managing information is a big part of their job. These are all people who have a need for this kind of thing. People who are lifelong learners. Maybe none of those things. Maybe you're not a researcher. Maybe you're not a student, at least not in a formal institution, but you're somebody who loves to read and loves to learn about things. Then this suits you well. So that's the first thing. I would say that the second thing then is becoming aware of your propensity for different technologies or attitude toward different technologies. Some people think better using paper, and it's, I don't want to push anyone to using computers if they find that that's not something that works for them. And like I said, there are ways to build systems like these using things like index cards. That said, if you do have affinity to using technology, then looking into tools like Obsidian, Notion, etc., is an obvious next step. Yes, there are note-taking tools that come bundled with our phones, things like Google Keep or Apple Notes on the iPhones, and those are good. They have some of the basic capabilities that are needed. I personally find them more useful for the transient notes that we were talking earlier. They don't make it very easy to link to other notes, which is kind of critical if you're going to build one of these systems, right? So that would be the second step, is looking into the technologies that are available. And then the third step would be learning to use these tools, but suspending your expectations about the way that they will transform your thinking, because it's not something that is going to happen overnight. You have to kind of go with it and realize that the thinking process and the process of working with these tools is as important as the outcome. So, don't become overly fixated with getting results. The results are the thinking that happens while you're learning to use the tools and taking notes themselves, right? So just grow comfortable with it and go from there.
Couple of thoughts here. So before digital was a thing that you had on your person at all times, honestly, I confess, back in high school, I had it was about the size of a phone, and it was a little pad of paper. Sometimes it was the spiral kind at the top where you'd flip it open. Other times there was it was almost like a mini legal pad, but it had a leather kind of binding to it, but it was still that same size. And I would keep that in a clicky pen so that it wouldn't leak all over my pocket. Even in high school, I would have that on me at all times just to capture things. But the problem is you then had to, if you captured it, put it somewhere, or review it often, and you'd be flipping through. I say that to say, for me, it's always been about capturing any and everywhere, but then having an interval that you move those into the place you want to keep it till you do something with it. And this is where it gets murky for some people. Some people think, is this a task? Is this an idea? Is it an idea that becomes a task down the road? And it's that, I don't want to use triage because that's more of an emergency type, although I guess maybe, yes, let's use triage, because you want to be able to do this quickly. You want to capture and then translate on a regular interval, whether that idea or thought or whatever goes into the garden or not. And again, it's a matter of what is this, and not thinking too hard about the what is this question as you're capturing it. It's the having a regular interval to ask what those things are later, and even having upfront tools like a reminders app. For example, yesterday, I think it was last night, it was my wife asked me, she said, "Oh man, we're out of eggs again." I'm like, I just bought some. So I quickly opened my phone and I said the words that summoned it, and I said, remind me to get eggs at, and I think I said 6 a.m. because I knew I would be up and I would go and then I would have them and get them. And so that's what happened. And then this morning, I'm giving a literal example here, but that's not a note. It is a note in one sense. It's information, but it's not something I have to do anything with past a certain point in time. That's almost the Post-it note I place somewhere for the next morning. But I digress. Ultimately, it's one of those things where having some of those initial tripwires set up, or decisions, quick, easy, 2-minute, what is this? Or decide this later kind of moments, then you can filter them through at one point early and then do deeper dive on them later.
Yeah, I'm sure you've seen the David Allen diagram, right? Where
this is where a lot of where I learned all of that from was David and 2-minute rule. Like if it's, something comes up, do I have 2 minutes? Will it take 2 minutes? Yes. Do I have 2 minutes right now? Yes. Do it. Or if either one of those is a no, then it's okay, when? and you have to park it in a place to be able to answer that when. If you can't answer, if you don't even have 2 minutes to decide much about it right now, it's when is the next decision-making calendar block that you have today or at a regular interval?
Yeah. At a baseline, you want to put the idea down, right? Like get it out of your head, get to the mind like water thing, right? You want to get it out of your head. That's the baseline thing. But then, it's not going to be any use, or it's not going to be as good for you if it just stays there. You have to have a second step, which is, well, now do something with it, right? And to your point, like it can either be done immediately, the 2-minute rule thing, or if I can't do something about it now, then a critical next step is know where you're going to put it so that you can find it when you need it. And that requires that you know what kind of thing is this, right? There's this kind of ontological question. Is that, what is this thing that I'm dealing with here? Is it a task? Get the eggs. Is it an appointment? I'm meeting with, Ross at 4 p.m. or whatever, right? Is it an evergreen note of the sort that we were talking about? And if it's an evergreen note, what is it related to? Is it related to a project that you want to circle back to at some point, right? So all of these things form part of a system that you have to develop if you are to keep from being pulled under by the information waves. This notion of drowning in information, I think that the folks who feel overwhelmed by this stuff, I think that a lot of them are probably overwhelmed because they have not developed the kind of literacy skills, the habits around processing these various inboxes and dealing with all this stuff. Like there's stuff that's going to be coming in all the time. We live in an information society. A lot of our jobs entail moving information around. If you don't develop the means to work with information, you're going to be pulled under, right? So I think that it's a basic skill that folks need to have, even if you're not building something like a knowledge garden.
I totally agree. And I think then the other key piece is let's get into a little bit of this tending of the garden, putting things in their right places. And then also a bit on, when we have things in their right place, like I kind of alluded to a little earlier with the maybe hybridization of seeds turning into hybrid fruits, how that sparks insights.
Yeah, this is where things can get a little complicated, right? Because we can say, well, you need to process your inbox and get stuff to the right place. The question then becomes, well, how do you define what the right place is? And that's going to be different for everybody. There are various folks who have proposed different taxonomies for dealing with stuff. One that is fairly popular these days is Tiago Forte's PARA method. I think PARA stands for projects, areas, reference, and archive, if I'm not mistaken. And that's a kind of high level set of binders or buckets where things are going to go. But if you buy into something like that, you start thinking about things like, well, is this idea that I'm writing down, is it related to a project? And if it's related to a project, then that implies that you have a taxonomy of projects that you're dealing with. That becomes an organization structure for you. And much like the David Allen approach, where you have different lists, right? You have a list of things that you're waiting a response for from others. You have a list of things that you can do at home. You have a list of things that you can do at the office. Well, now you start thinking of these various categories in which information can live. I have a list of projects. I have a list of areas. And you must develop the habit, much like you do with getting things done, to every once in a while go through your inboxes and move your notes to the right container so that you can find them later. Now, the tools that we are talking about here, things like Obsidian, and I'll speak to Obsidian in particular because it's the one that I use. These tools allow you to use not just folders, but also things like tags. And tags can be dangerous. Tags can be overused, but tags can also be really powerful because differently from folders, tags make it so that one piece of content, one note can be assigned to several different groups simultaneously, right? That's a very powerful capability. And you can start developing your own little taxonomies of tags. If you do this consistently over time, you will find yourself in a situation where you no longer have to waste time and cognitive energy trying to think where things are when you need them. I've been using Obsidian to capture meeting minutes for a long time. I think I'm going on like 3.5 years now that I've been doing that. And every time that I'm in a meeting, I create a note in Obsidian, and I include in that note not just notes about what happened in the meeting, but also what project it was related to and who was present in the meeting. And I also have notes in my Obsidian vault for each project. So each project gets a note. Each person gets a note as well. And because I've been linking notes in that way for a long time, I can easily do things like pull up a person's note and see a list of all of the meetings that I've been in with that person. Or I can pull up the project's note and see all of the meetings that I've had related to that project. That's an incredibly powerful capability because I can then do things like very quickly pull up, I can answer questions for myself like, what was it that we said in the last meeting for this thing? I can just pull it up like that, even though I have many, many, many hundreds, if not thousands of meeting notes at this point in this vault. That's an ability that I was not able to bring to bear when I was using paper for meeting minutes. So, it changes. It changes how you use notes. It changes how you manage information. And in this case, it has made it possible for me to be much more effective at my work. So these ideas have very practical consequences.
Speak a little bit to then, we've got these gardens that are our own, but then what if we're working with people that we want to let into our garden, or they have gardens of their own, and how do our gardens work together?
Yeah, that becomes much more complicated when you're dealing with multiple people. And I have to say upfront that the book is written with the perspective that you're going to be building one of these for yourself. The last chapter does deal with collaborating with others. Some tools are better at this than others. So Notion, I think, is much better at collaboration than something like Obsidian. Other note-taking tools, I talked about Apple Notes. Apple Notes lets you share notes with other people, right? You can collaboratively work with notes. OneNote is another popular one that lets you do that as well. Now, there are different issues here. One issue is collaboratively taking notes, which if you've never tried it, I highly recommend. It's a really powerful exercise, particularly for capturing meeting minutes. But another separate but related issue is structuring one of these systems so that people can find things later. It's one thing to do it for yourself. Let's say this taxonomy of projects that you have, right? Your taxonomy of projects may make sense to you, but it might not make sense to someone else. Now, if you're going to be collaborating with other people on these projects, then you have to come to some kind of agreement as to how you're going to structure that shared environment so that you can find things. And then this becomes a much more traditional information architecture project. You're no longer doing it kind of for yourself. Now you're doing it in a group. And that's something that you need to collaborate on with other folks if they're going to be working with you on this. One area that I see a lot of people struggling with, and I've struggled with as well, is in using shared whiteboard apps, things like Mural and Miro and FigJam. Usually what this happens is you start with one of these whiteboards, kind of like use a very common use case is like using it as a war room for a project. It's like, we're going to write down everything related to this project in this board, right? And that works really well for about the first 4 or 5 weeks or so. And then around week 6, if it's a very active board, all of a sudden you're like, oh, where was this thing that we did, a few weeks ago? And, you might bring new folks to collaborate it on the team and they can't find anything. Those kinds of things need much more upfront structure. And, if you have something like a new team member come in, then you have to have, explicit onboarding into these structures so that they can find things and also become effective contributors, right? And the thing doesn't, spiral into this, unruly mess that makes it difficult to use and, to find things later.
Once you start doing that, it's having the protocols of how we work the garden, how we tend the garden, where things are stored, which lines and which rows or which things as we plant and all these good things. I love metaphor, by the way, as you can probably tell. Obviously, there's so much more in the book that we can walk through. I think we skipped through like 2, 3, 4 chapters in the middle there. We got the high view, and we kind of ended here at the tail end. There's so much more here. There's so much more productive value here from this book, as well as your podcast. I'd love for you to tell people where they can jump to find out more about 1, the book, 2, your podcast, and then 3, to follow you and keep up with all that you're working on.
Well, fantastic. Thank you for that prompt. I'll give you 3 links. So the book you can find at dulynoted.fyi. So that's the website for the book, and you can see where to buy it. I highly recommend that you buy it from the publisher, Rosenfeld Media. It's a small company run by fabulous people. If you buy it there and you're an ebook reader, as I am, you get the added benefit of getting DRM-free versions of the book in different formats.
Great. So
check it out. The podcast is called The Informed Life, and you can find that in the main podcast directories, Apple's, Spotify's, etc. The website is theinformed.life. And then to keep up with my stuff, my personal website is jarango.com. So my first initial last name.com.
Perfect. Jorge, it's been great talking with you. And again, I hope that people were able to follow along, kind of parse it out for themselves. If not, rewind, go back, review like a note and go over those notes. But this is highly beneficial. And I think a lot of people are going to benefit from this. Thank you so much for sharing.
Thank you, Eric. And I would suspect that anyone who was taking notes as they were listening might have had an easier time of going back to it.
I totally agree.
Thank you so much.
Well, that's another podcast crossed off your listening to-do list. I hope that you enjoyed listening in and taking notes on this conversation with Jorge Arango. Make sure to jump to the links in the show notes at beyondthetodolist.com. You'll find a link to the book, links to Jorge's podcast, as well as all the other work he's working on. And if you found this podcast helpful, do me a favor, jump in and share it with somebody that you know needs to hear it. Hit that share button wherever you're listening to this, or again, over on the show notes at beyondthetodolist.com. Thanks again for sharing. Thank you also for listening, and I will see you next episode.